Good evening, everybody. For those of you who are here for the very first time, a warm welcome. I'm Tony Wakeford, your chairman and host for this evening. For those of you who have been with us before, you'll know the score. A little bit later on, we have a Q&A session, and as the talk goes along, if you have any questions, then I'd be grateful if you put them into the chat button, which you'll find at the centre and bottom of the screen. We had an email sent round a little while ago which had a link to the bookshop, and there are books available which have been signed. So if you'd like a book after the talk, then you'll be able to access the link from the email and go straight to the website and be able to purchase it with the usual discount of Friends membership. It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce Iain McLean, who's going to be talking to us about Aberfan, something which I vaguely remember as a child, and realising the significance even at a young age, just how serious that particular incident was. Iain is a senior lecturer and research fellow in politics at Nuffield College in Oxford, and he's a fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He has written widely on contemporary UK history, but considers that Aberfan is one of the most important books that he has ever written. And it'd be interesting tonight to hear that most of the material that will be shared this evening has actually come from the records held at the National Archives. So Iain, it's my great pleasure to give you the floor. You are amongst friends, so over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you everybody for coming to listen. Now, where's the control that allows me to screen share? Share screen. Is my screen now showing? Hello, is anybody out there can say, is my screen now showing?
Partly showing.
Partly.
Yes.
Right, I got to pull it across and get it up to full size.
And then if you have the slideshow.
Yes, I'm going to go to slideshow.
Yeah.
Right, is that better now?
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
Good.
Right, sorry, even though we've all been doing this for a year and a half, some of us are still not very good at it. That obviously is my title, and down at the bottom, I've got acknowledgements to various people, including, of course, the National Archives, and very much to my co-author, Martin Johns, who I first introduced to this as a research assistant, a research officer on some grants that I achieved. Now I'm going to see if I can, yes, has my second slide now come up? Can I just check?
Yes, it has.
Yes, it has.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I will now I'll proceed by the down arrow, and anybody who's unmuted can shout at me because I can't see the chat screen. So in essence, that is what happened. This picture from the National Archives is taken at, you can tell from the shadows, it's taken early afternoon on the day of the disaster, 21st October 1966. The tip, which has collapsed, has destroyed the Pancras Junior School, which is towards the right of the middle, and then the main slide went on to destroy a row of houses further down. A subsidiary slide going off to the right of the picture providentially didn't hit any houses. So in case anybody isn't aware, the total death toll at Aberfan was 144, of which 109 were children in Pancras School, and the further 5 were their teachers. So it was a pretty terrible event. That is a picture which, also from the National Archives, gives shows the school, or the wrecked school, in center picture, just above, below the deep runnel, which was caused by water coming from the destroyed tips. And the fact that there was so much water is at the heart of the Aberfan disaster. Here is a picture again from the National Archives of rescuers trying to get into the wreckage of the school. Once the flow slide of saturated coal slurry slowed down, it solidified. And so what you see at the right of the picture was like Pompeii. It was impossible. Nobody was rescued alive from that lot after 11 o'clock that morning. There are rescuers inside the school. Again, this photograph is from the records of the Aberfan Tribunal at FTNA. So to give some background, why me? Why Aberfan? So the disaster happened in 1966, October the 21st. I was an undergraduate student at the time, and like everybody else who was at least about 12 at that time, I was watching it on the telly that night, completely transfixed by the horror of it. And you wanted to do something, and at least I knew that jumping into a car with a spade, which thousands of people did, was not for me, partly because I didn't have a car, partly because I wouldn't have had the courage. But what I did was hold a whip round among students raised quite a serious amount of money, which went into the main disaster fund, which in 1968, the next date on here, was raided by the government of the day and the National Coal Board in order to part pay for the removal of all the other tips that you saw in that earlier slide. And that was thousands and thousands of tons of material. Now, it was plain to me at the time that this was unlawful. It was a charitable fund. It is not the purpose of a charity to remove the National Coal Board's tips, for which it is strictly liable, as I'll come to in a bit. So that reawakened my anger about Aberfan, and really it's been bubbling ever since, 55 years now since the disaster. In 1996, I was doing other work connected with the National Archives, and we wanted to test pilot a database which we were compiling of changes of function. So the date for opening records, general opening of records then, was 30 years. So I thought, what happened in 1966, and I hadn't even finished forming the thought in my head when I knew what I was going to look for. But I also knew that not necessarily all the Aberfan records would be released, because of the convention that the 30-year was then, the lower than that now, that the counting starts from the end of the year in which the record is closed. And some of the records on Aberfan were still open until as late as 1970. But a contact then at the archives alerted me that everything was going to be open from all the relevant departments on 1st January 1997. So I went along to the then editor of The Observer, Will Hutton, and said, please may I have your press pass? And it happened that the 1st of January 1997 was not a Sunday, and The Observer was not going to make a big thing of it. So he gave me the pass, and I spent 2 whole solid days of the press preview looking for stuff when I roughly knew where to look, because the tribunal, which on the whole was an excellent tribunal, had already been published in 1967. And it revealed some stuff which I'm about to show, which is just as shocking, I think, as anything else which has come out of Aberfan. In 2016, the 50th anniversary of the disaster, I was at Aberfan working behind the scenes for the BBC, and I met a number of people who had very striking stories. One of the more striking things is I met at least 2 cases, rescuers who'd come to the scene 50 years earlier and who had never come back. And I think that says something about the trauma, not only for the victims and their relatives, but for the rescuers. And one of those rescuers, in fact, the son of a rescuer, showed me a very evocative survivor of the disaster, which I'm going to show at the end of this presentation. So here we are, 2021, the 55th anniversary, and I think why one reason why interest has once again revived, never die, but was the very good, very well made Aberfan episode on season 3 of The Crown on Netflix, which many of you have seen. I hadn't seen it, but people kept asking me, is it accurate? Is that what happened? And so we joined Netflix, we took out a sub, we saw it, and on the whole, the answer is it is extremely accurate, uncannily and rather eerily so. Those of you who've seen the episode will know that there is a scene in one of the classrooms just as the slurry hits. And the actor who played the teacher in that scene is, I always have to say, I'm sorry to say, is the spitting image of one of the teachers in that school who was actually one of the 5 who was killed. So the accuracy goes to that creepy level. On their main theme of, does the Queen regret that she was late coming to Aberfan? I've got no insight, and there's nothing in the records. And also, importantly, nobody that I've ever met in and around Aberfan and Merthyr has been upset at the role played by the Queen, who did come within about 10 days of the disaster. The Duke of Edinburgh came earlier. But that is, if you will, dramatic license. So in my next slide, I'll show you some of the sources which Martin and I used to produce our book. Then I will go through some interesting documents. I'm sorry that current conditions mean that it's not been possible to get photocopies of the original documents where they're in the archive. So I'm afraid I've just had to transcribe from the copies that I made, many of them on those 2 intensive days in December 1996. I'm going to show evidence of the negligence beforehand, the cover-up afterwards, and finish on the question of whether things have improved. So here's a note on sources. The tribunal report, that is its reference as a House of Commons paper, and the supporting papers for the tribunal were preserved in a class BD 52. BD is Welsh Office, you wouldn't guess that from the letters. We used other classes under BD. The transcripts from the tribunal are a very important document. They're not held in the National Archives, but we found a set in very poor condition in Merthyr Library, which had been the set that had belonged to the Borough Council and its council. And Martin and I did some physical conservation and made up the set from missing numbers. And they are very dramatic in places, and they were used by the BBC reconstruction programme in 2016. Within the archives, and I'll focus on that, 3 departments are central. The Welsh Office, we need to bear in mind, had only been in existence for 2 years. It was a manifesto promise of the 1964 Labour government when it came in that it would create a Welsh Office, which it did. And the Welsh Office, therefore, was the most junior department in Whitehall. And the records show, I'm afraid, very clearly that in power plays in Whitehall, I'm talking about civil service power plays, if you will, more than politicians' power plays, the Welsh Office was much less important than the next one on the list, the Ministry of Power. Ministry of Power, as the documents I'm going to show reveal, saw itself as the sponsor of the Coal Board and other power entities, but the biggest by far was the Coal Board, and acted, in this case, in the interests of the producers, not in the interests of consumers or the public, or indeed the people of Aberfan and South Wales. The Coal Board itself was an enormous nationalised industry, and one of the odd consequences of that is that its records are in the National Archives under class mark coal. It was to all intents and purposes a government department, and the fact that those records are there means that it was quite easy to find out what was going on behind the scenes in the Coal Board, and this was not a pretty sight. And then many of you will know class mark Prem, which is Prime Minister's private office papers. That was where we went to find out reaction at the top of politics. And I tried to summarize the reaction there in my notes, that Prime Minister Wilson was shocked and horrified by Aberfan, but failed to take the, as I'm going to try to show, the most effective and I would have thought mandatory action open to him, which would have been to sack the the entire board, including the chairman of the Cull board, and also to consider prosecutions. None of these things happened. So we also used local archives. The papers of the disaster fund itself are in the Glamorgan archives, and some pearls from that I will be showing you later. The National Library of Wales holds some archives of some participants, and it also holds an archive of photographs made by the American photographer Chuck Rappaport. He was a photographer for Life magazine, which was then a huge thing. And he stayed on in Aberfan when all the other reporters had gone and got under the skin of the community. And I'll show you something from his collection towards the end. So here are some nuggets from the documents. I've chosen ones that tend to cause a sharp indrawing of breath when people read them. So the first one comes within only 5 to 6 days of the disaster. It's in the Prime Minister's private office papers. The Cardiff paper, the Western Mail, has been saying that there should be a memorial service in Westminster Abbey. Prime Minister's private office advises against this on various grounds, but the most stunning one is, as shown here, that the Prime Minister Wilson was told that the Welsh Church is disestablished and has no claim on Westminster Abbey. So much for the idea of a place of national celebration. So there was no memorial. There were funeral services in Aberfan itself, of course, but the nearest to a memorial service, I think, is the first performance of Sir Carl Jenkins' oratorio, Cantata Memoria for the Children, which I strongly recommend that you should get hold of. It was first performed immediately before the 50th anniversary with a solo baritone by Bryn Terfel. Then I go to a document which we found in the disaster fund papers in the Glamorgan archives in Cardiff. And this is the Charity Commission's advice to the disaster fund. Before any payment was made, each case should be reviewed to ascertain whether the parents had been close to their children and thus likely to be suffering mentally. So this was an extraordinarily Victorian interpretation of charity law, suggesting that you couldn't make flat rate payments, but you had to inquire and presumably deny funds to anybody who you suspected had not been close to their deceased children. So we unearthed that one, and that made another headline in the Observer a couple of weeks later under the heading, "Were you close to your dead child?" The trustees stood up, and I honour them for that. They ignored the advice, which potentially put them at considerable financial risk, and so they did make flat rate payments to bereaved families. Now, reproduction quality may not be great of the slides that I've taken from the tribunal report. So let me interpret this for you. This is one of the plates from the tribunal report. That is Aberfan village on the right of the map. North is top, so the black oblongs towards the top left-hand corner of the village are the schools. This is the Ordnance Survey 1919, and the deadly evidence, it's probably too small for people to see, but this is the detailed ordnance map before the tips were put up, and scattered across in various places. If you're on a large screen, you can see the word rise. Rise means the same as spring. So that mountainside rising up west of Aberfan was full of springs, which sprang in wet weather. And you don't need to be a soil mechanic engineer to know that putting stuff on a mountainside on top of a spring is a spectacularly silly thing to do. Here from the BD52 class is essentially the same map at blown up scale, showing the path of the disaster slide. So that is showing, if you will, in plan, what the photographs showed in elevation, and it shows the main tongue of the slide coming down. It seems to have only clipped a corner of the school, but that was a corner in which there were 5 classes, and then completely destroyed houses in Moy Road, where there were about 20 or 30 victims. This again is from the tribunal report. The photograph from directly above is taken in about 1963, and it's important to the story because if you look at the tips from the top down. The top one was called, that is to the top of the photograph. Top one was called tip 5, and you can see at between 7 and 9 o'clock on tip 5, there was a little slide. It's not perfectly conical. Next one down is tip 4, and you can see that some really bad stuff has happened to tip 4. It's far from conical, and there's been a big slide going from about 6 o'clock to about 9 o'clock, which the tribunal established occurred in 1944. And just below that, the curve running from right to left is the track of the tramway that carried the spoil, was where the geniuses who put tip 7, the disaster tip, in place, put it in 1958. So here's a 1963 picture showing that the tip, which was to slide, was placed not only on top of springs, but also on top of the earlier slide from tip 4. How idiotic can you get? So the tribunal established that, in the rather poetic words of Lord Justice Edmund Davis, its chair, that Colborne witnesses were like moles being asked about the habits of birds. They had no idea. The elite of the mining industry worked underground, and nobody was paying any attention to the tips. There had been slides in the South Wales valleys, 4 of them. There was a fatal one in 1909, which the tribunal missed, but we found without much difficulty in the local press. There was an enormous one in 1939 on the other side of the valley at Kilvannath. Luckily, there was nobody underneath at the time, but it blocked the main road. Tip 4, as I've just said, slid in 1944, and again in 1963, and that date turns out to be rather crucial. Tipping on springs, I've said all I need to say. The Coal Board had an internal memorandum which was reissued in 1965, saying, as you see here, where a slide would cause damage to property, no tip over 20 feet high should be placed on the hillside unless the ground is a compact gravel or better quality than this. It shouldn't be necessary to say that a former tip shear surface soaked with springs in wet weather is not a better quality than compact gravel. So tip 7 should never have been put there. Actually, neither should tips 4 or 5, the ones higher up. Here in the council archives, we found this quite chilling letter. It's from the Borough Waterworks engineer of Merthyr Council, which Aberfan comes under. And they write to the area mechanical engineer of the Coal Board. And the heading is, well, it speaks for itself, danger from coal slurry being tipped at the rear of the Pancras schools. And I am very apprehensive about this matter, says Mr. Jones. This apprehension is also in the minds of the local councillors, quite right. And they've experienced during periods of heavy rain the movement of the slurry. You are no doubt well aware that the tips at Merthyr Vale tower above the Pancras area, and if they were to move, a serious position would accrue. It took 7 months for a substantive answer to come to this letter. And this is Mr. Roberts' reply. Note the bit in red. We would not like to continue beyond the next 6 to 8 weeks in tipping it on the mountainside where it could be a source of danger to Pancras School. So that letter was written in February of 1964. Needless to say, and you've already inferred, the tipping continued until the 21st of October 1966. But what's more damning is that in between those letters, the letter from the council and the reply from the Coal Board, a further slip occurred. And this is the language of the tribunal, and is really a classic of Whitehall language. They established that in November, there occurred a rotational slide of a substantial portion of the actual body of the tip, the disaster tip. The gravity of such a conclusion from the point of view of the National Coal Board is manifest. That's a threatening sentence. And then they go on, it was not until the 66th day of the tribunal that the issue of whether or not there had been a slide of tip 7 late in 1963 was removed from the realm of controversy. That's Mandarin language, but you can see it's a very powerful condemnation of the Coal Board. Then we come to Lord Robens, the chairman of the Coal Board, who visited Aberfan 36 hours after the disaster. In the meantime, he had been sworn in as the Chancellor of Surrey University. So Harold Wilson got there first. And he went around telling people that it was all due to an unknown spring. And this is the tribunal's verdict on Lord Robens. It's magnificently savage. Here's the most operative phrase: "For the National Coal Board, through its council, to invite the tribunal to ignore the evidence given by its chairman was remarkable. Nevertheless, the invitation is one which we think it right to accept." I think you can see the passion behind the civil service prose. So why on earth did Lord Robens survive? The answer is deeply political. Ministers of both parties thought he was indispensable. He had been appointed by the preceding Conservative government, Prime Minister Macmillan, for a 10-year stint as chair of the coal board. Politicians of both parties knew that the coal industry at the time was too big. It was losing shed loads of money. It would have to be closed down. It's not closed down, but it would have to be reduced in size. This would provoke miners' strikes, and politicians of all parties were terrified of the power of the National Union of Mine Workers. So they thought, both parties thought, that Lord Robens, who had himself been a trade union leader in another union, was the indispensable person who could slim down the coal industry without provoking massive slides. Lord Robens was aware that that was what politicians thought of him, and but even they didn't have such a high opinion of him as he did of himself. He believed that he ought to have become Prime Minister or leader of the Labour Party just before he was appointed to the coal board. And he had a sufficiently low opinion of Prime Minister Wilson that he was involved in the plot, which some of you will know through another episode of The Crown, season 3, to depose the government of Harold Wilson and bring in effect, a military government underneath Lord Mountbatten, who did, as it shows in The Crown, reject the idea, although it's not quite clear that he actually rejected it in such firm tones as he's showing in The Crown. So after he's finished, after Robens has finished at the coal board, he is appointed in 1972 to chair a committee on, of all things, health and safety at work. That has been an important committee because it gave rise to the 1974 Health and Safety at Work Act, which has governed health and safety ever since. If you stand back and look at it now, and when we were preparing our book, we were completely gobsmacked that possibly the single most unsuitable person in the United Kingdom to chair a committee on health and safety at work had been appointed to this job. We talked to some civil servants who had been involved. It wasn't thought of as controversial at the time, but it's clear from contemporary political documents, including the diaries being kept by Richard Crossman, Labour Minister, that this was a move to shunt Robens aside to a position where he would no longer endanger elected politicians. So, on receipt of the tribunal report, which Harold Wilson annotates, "This is devastating," as indeed it is, the cabinet had an inconclusive discussion. There was a faction which wanted to sack Robens, and there was a faction which said, "Hang on, we need this guy in place because of the coal industry." So they came to a rather weak decision that they wouldn't force him out, but they would accept his resignation if he offered it. So he goes along and meets the Minister of Power, Richard Marsh. It's relevant here that Richard Marsh was very young. He was one of the younger, he possibly the youngest cabinet minister in Harold Wilson's government, quite inexperienced, and he crumbled in front of Robens' attitude. But here we have, again, an unusual minute. You see it's from the Ministry of Power records from Marsh's private office of the discussion between Robens, and it's obvious that Robens wasn't having it. As you see, the tribunal had shown their bias in their criticism of his own evidence. Well, they had criticized his own evidence, and for very good reason. You could see the minister said that any criticism of the tribunal by the board would be liable to misinterpretation. And I've highlighted, after a good deal of further discussion, Lord Robens agreed that this was so. So I imagine the meeting went on for a couple of hours. Then Robens announced that he would give his resignation to the government next Tuesday morning. And you see the threat in the last sentence of the minute, unless the government expressed his confidence in him. So what Robens is doing there to Marsh is saying, it's an ultimatum from Robens to Marsh, express your confidence in me by the 8th of August or else. Or else what? Well, Robens did submit his resignation letter and Marsh didn't accept it. He waited. Public opinion seemed to show, I think there were some polls, that the public were not in favour of sacking Robens, who then, and this is 1967, so going to the US on the Queen Mary is rather an odd thing to do, unless you have the intention of not being able to reply to letters for several days. And so the government has to call in the UK ambassador to the UN, Lord Caradon, to act as a message boy to Robens. And here's Caradon's note back to the Ministry of Power. He asked me to make the following reply. Begins, provided the sentence, it is the whole board, not the chairman alone, which is appointed by the minister and responsible for him to the operations of the industry, is deleted, my reply would be as follows. So notes what's going on here. Robens is not only dictating his own letter to Marsh, he's also dictating the terms in which the minister will reply to him. The minister did delete that sentence over protests from his private office. I interviewed the late Alan Blackshaw, who was in Marsh's private office at the time, who explained that they had put that sentence in for a reason, which was to show the culpability of the entire coal board, but Robens insisted on it being taken out. I've already mentioned that in 1968, the government, in effect, forced the disaster fund to pay. Initially, it was £250,000, but it was reduced to 150,000 for the removal of the remaining tips. But I've already shown you the Powell Memorandum, which shows that the tips should never have been there. In law, there was a strict liability from a Victorian case called Rylands versus Fletcher, that the owner of the tips had liability even if it was not at fault, which in this case it plainly was, but even if it had not been at fault, it was strictly liable for any damage caused by its tips. Therefore, without any question whatsoever, it was improper for the government to force the charitable disaster fund to pay up, and the Charity Commission stood by at the time, having hassled the fund about other things. And the Charity Commission did apologise when our first articles came out in 1997. They put up their hands and said, we shouldn't have done this, or we should have, I'm sorry, intervened. So it shows, and some other documents I will come to, show the deeply ingrained culture of the protection of the coal industry. While the coal board was purportedly going along with removing the other tips while making clear that it wouldn't pay for it, it briefed the minister, and the thing which I put in italics is a briefing note from the minister's private office to the Secretary of State for Wales to use in the Aberfan debate if the question was raised. This was October '67, and you see the civil servants writing this say that the sum that they're going to mention as the cost of removing the tips is deliberately ambiguous. Complete removal, they go on to say, it would cost 3 million. Well, no, it wouldn't, because a local contractor by the name of Lawrence Ryan had already gone to the coal board and to local media saying, I'll remove it for you if you let me recover the coal that it contains, and I'll do it for 600,000. And so the minister is advised to reject that offer. And here are the grounds given, and I put it in reds to illustrate the ministerial attitudes of the coal board at the time. The sale of the coal is a problem. This is the coal that Ryan would have recovered from the tips. It displaces deep mine coal when the mines cannot be closed fast enough and their stockpiles are swollen. So a modern perspective would be, well, whose problem is that? If it's coal and it has a value, of course it should be in the market. If the contractor can sell the coal cheaply to the detriment of the NCB, well, again, if government was pro-consumer, the idea that it is in the interest of the consumer that he should have expensive coal from the coal board rather than cheap coal from Lawrence Ryan is rather striking. And in fact, I've missed off that slide the most damning thing of all, which is that the note ended that the coal board would confirm that Ryan had a reputation for leaving tips in a shambles. So at that point in our book, we just put the original dictionary definition of shambles. and mildly commented that the coal board was in no position to say that other people left tips in shambles. So I must work towards an end. What has happened? The tips were removed, all of them. It's very difficult to see any trace of the disaster on the mountain. The trunk road, Cardiff to North Wales, the A470, now crosses the disaster site. In the village, there's a cemetery which was built with disaster funds, and there is a memorial garden on this shape of and showing the outline of the Pantglas schools. And a community centre was built on the side of the destroyed houses on Moy Road, which you saw in that plan. In 1997, shortly after the change of government, the new Secretary of State for Wales, Ron Davis, gave the fund its money back. And I was very honoured that he cited our work, among others, the motivation for doing this. But he only gave it back at par. He gave 150,000 1997 pounds back. It wasn't until 2007 that the Welsh government made up the fund to what it should have done to allow for the real value of the money removed in 1968. As far as I'm aware, no PTSD claim, post-traumatic stress disorder claim, against successors of the coal board has succeeded. The PTSD suffered by survivors and relatives is patent, and there have been studies of this, but no claim has succeeded. I've already mentioned that I was there on the 50th anniversary. Prince Charles came and some rescuers who had not come for 50 years, and I'm going to finish, or almost finish, with the arm. This is my second last picture. This is one of Rappaport's pictures. He, as I said, he stayed in Aberfan for a few weeks after the disaster, and he said the squad of young miners were the friends that he made while he was living in the village. This is a teenage miner, eyes in greying coal dust, and I think the picture is very eloquent about what it was like to be a young person in Aberfan at the back end of 1966. Finally, this. This photograph was taken immediately after the disaster by a press photographer for one of the South Wales papers, and it comes from one of the destroyed houses in Moy Road. It shows that the disaster struck at 13 minutes past 9, and unquestionably instantly killed all the inhabitants of the house. The clock then disappeared from sight for many years, and to my astonishment, it was produced and shown to me by one of the rescuers, or as I say, the son of a rescuer, who had acquired it. I think it stayed with the rescuer because there was no family to give it back to. And he said he was going to donate it to the National Museum at St. Fagans. I've looked up their records and it doesn't seem to have been catalogued there, but it is kind of the most memorable single image from Aberfan, and I leave you with that, and I'll be very happy to take questions.
Iain, just a moment's silence there. Very poignant picture, very poignant indeed. If anybody has any questions, please can you post them in the chat line, and then we can pick them off. Iain, can I just start by asking, do we know everything about Aberfan? All the documents been released, or is there any redacted material that you're aware of?
Nothing redacted, and so I think kudos to the people who in 1996, the people at the National Archives themselves, people in the sponsoring departments, because really all three departments, Welsh Office, Coal Board and Ministry of Power, none of them comes up smelling of roses from these documents, but the whole lot was released, and no redactions. There is one mystery, which I mentioned to Tony before we came on air, which is that when we looked in the Charity Commission files, and the Charity Commission is another non-ministerial department, its records are also at Kew, but no case file on Aberfan, which must have been its biggest issue during 1967-68, and we don't know what happened to it. It's very hard to believe that it can have been weeded, but
Yeah.
It was not there when we were writing our book from the National Archives, and if it's been found since, nobody's told me.
That's interesting because one would assume a file of that importance would have been quite large. It would have been quite a substantial piece of work, and it would be hard to imagine that it could possibly be breeded.
Yep, that's why, as I said at the beginning, our records of the interaction between the Charity Commission and the Disaster Fund come from the Disaster Fund's end,
Yeah.
including that letter that I showed.
Mm. And the inquiry itself seemed to be set up quite quickly, didn't it?
The inquiry was set up extremely quickly. It was set up within 6 days of the disaster. The Prime Minister commissioned Edmund Davis, who was a judge of I think the appeal court at the time, and was a man from the next valley over, the Aberdare Valley. And on the whole, although I have some quibbles, on the whole, I think the tribunal did a magnificent job, and its counsel, and also counsel for the Parents and Residents Association of Aberfan, Desmond Ackner, who later became Lord Ackner, became a law lord. He was a very powerful figure, and the power of his cross-examinations comes across in the transcripts.
So how long did the inquiry take itself from start to finish?
There were 74 sitting days. It was the longest inquiry up to that date.
Yes.
And as Ackner rightly complained, and the tribunal says, one of the reasons the tribunal is so excoriating about the Coal Board is that the tribunal established that the Coal Board knew from the day the tribunal opened that it was at fault, that it had been tipping on springs, that the location of the springs was known, but it wouldn't admit that until day 66 of the tribunal. So, as Ackner said, and the tribunal endorsed, 66 pretty well unnecessary days were spent establishing the truth of something that the Coal Board had not been prepared to admit.
Why do you think that was?
I can only put it down once again to the immense power at the time of the National Coal Board. It was the biggest employer in South Wales. It was vastly bigger than the local authorities. The power relation, as the exchange of letters between Mr. Jones and Mr. Roberts shows, the power relation was very asymmetric.
Yeah.
The local council is having to beg the Coal Board not to tip at the back of its schools. And the Coal Board says it will stop tipping, and then it didn't. Tony, are you or are other people going to read out questions from the chat, or do you want me to pick them up myself?
Yeah, I was just going to pick out one from Katrina. What lessons does this have for now with the power industries largely in the private sector?
Okay, well, with the power industries in the private sector, you can't have such blatant, strong language, really, corruption of state power, as was seen in the aftermath of Aberfan. No private company could be in a position to do the things that the Coal Board did. And the very health and safety legislation of which Lord Robens introduced, or of course he didn't write the report, it was the Secretariat who wrote it, has ensured a much better regime of corporate liability than existed in 1966. That applies both to public corporations and to private ones. And that has come, we had a chapter on this in the first edition of our book, which we dropped in the second, not because it was no longer relevant, but because we wanted to put more Aberfan stuff in the second edition. But it has come not so much through the development of a law of corporate manslaughter, which has proved unexpectedly difficult to bring in, as in the very powerful, sometimes multi-thousand, sometimes multi-million fines imposed on companies which breach health and safety law. And they are named and shamed. That cultural change, we said in the first edition of the book, was evident by the time of the, what was then British Rail, Clapham disaster in 1988, when the chair of British Rail turned up personally in court to apologise. Something which would have been inconceivable from Lord Robens 20 years earlier.
Yeah. So does Robens have a positive legacy in as much as what he went on to do with health and safety? Did he?
Well, the Health and Safety Committee was an important committee.
Yeah.
We didn't find any evidence that Lord Robens was much involved in writing it, but it was an important initiative by the then department. I can't tell you which department it was. It certainly is foundational in health and safety law as it now exists.
Okay. Has anybody got any questions? It seems to be, here we go. Although the, this is from Oliver, although the NCB admitted their faults eventually in the tribunal, was any direct official apology ever extended to the families of those who lost loved ones?
No. And I might even quarrel with the fact that it's admitted. An admission was forced out of it after 66 days from the tribunal in very indirect terms. Yeah. And we've uncovered coal board papers, which I could have shown, showing that the coal board self-insured. It knew it was their insurers knew that they were liable for colliery, the consequence of colliery bills. And they proposed a payment of £50 per bereaved family. And there was pressure to raise this, and one of the insurance officers said something to the effect that it's only the aggrieved minority who are complaining, but eventually they did cough up the magnificent sum of £500 to each bereaved family.
Right. Yes. And question from Maura, how is this remembered today in Aberfan?
As I said, the cemetery, which was constructed, the part of the cemetery where the victims are buried, was constructed immediately after the disaster. It's still there. It's 2 rows of arches with lots of many of the deceased are commemorated by, in effect, their school pictures. So it's a very powerful scene. That's at the southwest end of the village. If you remember again the map that I showed, the tips were to the west. There was a disused railway and a disused canal, which the manager of the mine foolishly thought would catch any spill. You then walk along the disused railway or the disused canal to the top end of the village, where you find the site, as I said, the site of Pantglas School is now a memorial garden, and it is really treated pretty solemnly by people from all over Wales and beyond who come to see it.
Yeah. Right, we have a flurry of questions have come in. One from David. Obviously, you mentioned the NCB having acted to cover up, and you can understand, if not, of course, condone, why they wanted to avoid being judged as liable. But what do you think drove the actions of the civil servants, charity commission, etc.? Were they complicit?
Yes, that's a tough one because, of course, the civil service was quite varied. And I would take the principal departments rather separately. In the Welsh office, as I said, our impression from the papers is that they were really pushed aside, but the Welsh office sent an assistant secretary to live or to work in the Aberfan area or in Merthyr, and he gives reports somewhat like a colonial governor in the darkest northern Nigeria or something, of the strange habits of the natives. He's reporting to head office in Cardiff, and that at least is showing culturally what everybody who knows South Wales knows, which is that the culture of the valleys is very different to the culture of the metropolis down at the bottom of the valleys. So this guy seems to have been pretty insensitive to the trauma. But other than that, I wouldn't particularly fault the Welsh office. The Ministry of Power, I think, was more inculpated, as I've already shown some documents showing that civil servants seem to see their role as protection of the coal industry. Not all of them. I know, because from one of our interviews, as I mentioned, the late Alan Blackshaw, who was in Marsh's private office, was one of those who was horrified by the behaviour of Robens and the coal board, but was, as I showed, unable to lay a finger on them. And then as the coal board itself, I mean, its staff were devoted to the protection of the coal industry, notably including its insurance staff, who were responsible for its self-insurance, and who, I suppose you might say, like insurance companies anywhere, didn't want to pay out on claims. But that left them really astonishingly insensitive to what they'd done.
Yes. Yes. And I think we'll take this as our final question from Francis. How does this feed into Welsh nationalism today?
We discussed that a bit in our book. I mean, Welsh nationalism immediately at the time, well, the first Welsh nationalist by-election victory happened just before the disaster. So Gwynfor Evans was in the House when the Aberfan debate took place in 1967. And he said, if this had happened, you know, they would never have allowed this to happen in England. And that's a point of view, I think, which you get from a lot of Welsh people, especially South Wales people, that South Wales is treated as a distant province. And in at least a cultural sense, I think that does give some backing to Welsh nationalism. There have been times, not particularly at the moment, but there have been times when Plaid Cymru has done well in Welsh Senedd elections in the valleys, if people are dissatisfied with the Labour Party, which is the one that traditionally rules in the valleys. But I think, you know, it contributes to a sense of cultural nationalism, whether or not you're a political nationalist. And I would cite Carl Jenkins' cantata as evidence of how deeply feelings in Wales still run about this more than 50 years on.
Yes, for sure. You made the comment that Plaid thought that it would be something that would never happen in England. Were there comparable situations in any of the mining communities in England?
No, and one reason is just geographical, that South Wales was the only mining district where the coal seams were in steep-sided valleys, and the coal was very valuable. Would still be very valuable if any of it was still being got out, because it's a very high quality of coal. And you had to put the tips somewhere, and nobody thought of anywhere better than putting them on the side of the mountain. This has not been an issue was not an issue in any of the other UK coal fields. But you know, I have just seen in the papers quite recently that there are still tips which are giving concerns to local councils in parts of South Wales, even though they've been abandoned for 30 or 40 years now.
Yes. Iain, thank you very much. That was a very, very interesting talk, and I'm very grateful for your time this evening in sharing some of your research. And I can well understand that there's an awful lot of harrowing detail in there which you've not shared, but that's history, and it's, as long as it's there and it's documented, we won't forget. So thank you. Thank you very much. So if you could stay with us briefly after we finish, that would be great. We've got if Maggie can bring up the next slide, please. We've got some more talks coming up in the next month. Just get them up for you. And we've got one on the 3rd of November. And we're pleased to welcome Major General Peter Williams, who was part of the Bricksmiths mission to Soviet-occupied Germany during the Cold War. He's coming to talk to us about his role and the role of the mission itself in Germany. And then of particular interest to me, this is absolutely fascinating. We've got a talk, I'm very pleased to have organised this one with Professor Christopher Lovelock from the University of Nottingham. He's going to come and talk to us about the ice core, alpine ice core research, and what they've been able to find in terms of looking back with what's embedded in the ice up in the Alps that links back to industrial activity in medieval England. And so we're able to bring together research from the 21st century with the documented activity that's in the pipe rolls, which is in the building that you see in front of you. So those are two talks coming up. We have got one last talk for the year, which is on the 7th of December. We are not absolutely 100% sure yet if it's going to be an event live at TNA or whether we're going to have to stick with Zoom. I'm waiting for some official guidance to come on that, but we will probably publish some details on that very shortly. And it's Lord Lexton who's going to be talking to us on the 7th of December about Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill, wartime partners. So thank you for joining us this evening. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you again on the 3rd of November. So until then, keep calm and carry on, and thank you very much.